The sun rose over Columbus, Ohio, casting a soft golden light across the quiet suburban streets. Gerald Hand sat at the kitchen table, the crisp scent of brewed coffee filling the air. He scanned the morning newspaper, his reading occasionally interrupted by the sound of Jill, his wife, moving around the kitchen. Her movements were quick and efficient, but there was something detached about them, as if her mind were elsewhere. Jill placed a plate of toast in front of him, her smile faint but polite. Gerald glanced up. "Thanks," he muttered, his eyes catching hers briefly. She nodded, avoiding his gaze. He noticed the way she tugged at the cuff of her sweater, an unspoken nervousness in her gesture. But Gerald dismissed it. After all, they had been married for years, and small moments of distance were normal in any relationship, or so he thought. The day began like any other. Gerald left for work, his briefcase in hand, and Jill waved goodbye from the front door. It was a practiced routine, one they had performed countless times. Yet as Gerald drove through the familiar streets toward his office, a faint unease crept into his thoughts. He couldn't place it, just a fleeting sense that something was off. At work, Gerald buried himself in meetings and contracts, thriving in the world of business negotiations. His colleagues admired his calm demeanor and sharp instincts. To them, Gerald Hand was the epitome of success, a dedicated professional with a beautiful wife and a stable home life. But success often hides fractures that only reveal themselves when the surface is scratched. When Gerald returned home that evening, he found Jill in the living room, her attention fixed on a book. She barely looked up when he entered. "Good day at work?" she asked absently. "It was fine," Gerald replied, setting his briefcase down. "Yours?" Jill shrugged. "Same as always." Her tone was light, but Gerald caught the subtle shift in her expression. He chose not to press further, though a part of him wanted to ask more. The following morning brought another ordinary start, but this time as Gerald sipped his coffee, he noticed something peculiar on the counter, an unfamiliar cufflink polished to a shine. "Is this yours?" he asked, holding it up. Jill turned, her eyes widening briefly before she recovered. "Oh, I found it under the couch," she said too quickly. "It must belong to a guest from one of our dinners." Gerald nodded slowly, setting the cufflink down. It seemed plausible, but her reaction lingered in his mind. As he left for work, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to the story. That afternoon, Gerald received an anonymous letter at his office. Its words were simple but cutting. "Your wife is not who you think she is." He read the note twice, his chest tightening. A cold sweat formed on his brow as the weight of the words pressed against him. Who would send this? Was it a cruel joke? Or was there truth in these cryptic lines? That evening, Gerald returned home, the letter burning in his pocket. Jill greeted him as usual, her voice steady but her eyes distant. As she turned back toward the kitchen, Gerald felt a pang of unease. Was the life they had built together as solid as it seemed? Or was there something hidden beneath the surface? Something he had failed to see? For the first time in years, Gerald looked at his wife, not with familiarity, but with doubt. The anonymous letter weighed heavily on Gerald Hand's mind as he sat in his office the following day. The words echoed in his thoughts, stirring something he couldn't ignore. He considered throwing it away, chalking it up to a prank or malicious rumor, but the doubt it planted grew roots too deep to be dismissed. By lunch, he folded the note into his pocket and decided to confide in someone he trusted. That evening, Gerald met his cousin Sarah at a local coffee shop. Sarah, sharp-eyed and always intuitive, had a knack for noticing things others didn't. As they sipped their drinks, Gerald pulled out the letter and slid it across the table. Sarah read it quickly, her brows knitting together. "Do you think it's true?" Gerald asked, his voice steady, but his hand betrayed him, trembling as he lifted his cup. Sarah hesitated, then sighed. "Gerald, I wasn't going to say anything, but I saw Jill last week." She paused, gauging his reaction. "She was at the Savoy Grill with Walt. It looked personal." "Walt Maxwell?" Gerald asked, his tone sharpening. Sarah nodded. "I thought maybe it was just a business meeting, but the way they were sitting, the way they leaned into each other, it didn't look like business to me." Gerald's stomach churned. Walt wasn't just a friend. He was family. The idea of Jill and Walt sharing something behind his back felt like a betrayal of the worst kind. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I didn't want to upset you if it was nothing," Sarah said softly. But after seeing this, she tapped the letter with her fingernail. "You need to be careful." Gerald drove home in silence that night, his thoughts spinning. Jill was waiting for him in the living room, her book open on her lap. She looked up as he entered, offering him a brief smile. It wasn't the warm smile he remembered from their early years. It was mechanical, practiced. "How was your day?" she asked, her tone light but distant. "Fine," he replied curtly, loosening his tie. "Yours?" "Same as always." She shrugged, her eyes darting back to the book. Gerald noticed her phone on the coffee table, its screen lighting up briefly with a notification before going dark again. He sat across from her, watching as she turned the page without really reading. "Who's messaging you this late?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. Jill stiffened, glancing at the phone. "Oh, just a reminder for the book club," she said quickly, tucking the phone into her pocket. "Nothing important." Gerald nodded, but his instincts screamed otherwise. The crack in their relationship was widening, and he could feel the distance growing between them. That night, as Jill slept soundly beside him, Gerald stared at the ceiling, replaying Sarah's words in his mind. The next morning, Gerald began noticing the small things. Jill's sudden need to lock her phone, her new habit of taking long grocery runs that stretched into hours, the way she carefully chose her words like she was hiding something. It all started adding up. That afternoon, as Gerald sifted through paperwork at the office, his secretary knocked lightly on the door. "Mr. Hand." "This came for you," she said, placing an envelope on his desk. It was plain, with no return address. Gerald opened it cautiously. Inside was a single piece of paper, a receipt from the Savoy Grill dated the week prior, 2 meals, 2 glasses of wine. The pit in Gerald's stomach deepened. He left work early, the receipt tucked into his pocket. When he arrived home, Jill was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself. It was a tune he didn't recognize. "What's that song?" he asked, leaning in the doorway. Jill froze for a split second before smiling. "Just something I heard on the radio," she replied, her voice too casual. Gerald nodded, his expression unreadable. The cracks beneath the surface were becoming too wide to ignore, and he knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to light. Gerald Hand's world, once so meticulously ordered, began to unravel. The receipt from the Savoy Grill lay on his desk at home, taunting him with its silent accusations. 2 meals, 2 glasses of wine. The date was etched clearly, matching the day Sarah claimed she saw Jill and Walt together. As dusk fell, Gerald sat in his study, the edges of the receipt fraying under his restless fingers. His thoughts spiraled. How long had this been going on? Was it a passing dalliance, or had he been blind to something far deeper? The next day, Gerald decided he needed to see for himself. He left the office earlier than usual, telling his secretary he had a personal matter to attend to. He parked his car a block away from the Savoy Grill and waited. The minutes ticked by, stretching into an hour. Just as he began to question his decision, a familiar figure emerged from a nearby parking lot. Jill, her hair swept neatly, wearing a dress Gerald didn't recognize. His heart pounded as he watched her glance around before heading into the restaurant. A few moments later, Walt Maxwell strode in, his demeanor confident, almost casual. Gerald's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He waited 10 minutes before entering. Keeping his distance, he scanned the dining area. There, in a corner booth, Jill and Walt sat together, their heads close, laughing over something only they understood. Gerald's breath caught as he observed them. Jill's hand rested briefly on Walt's, her expression soft, a look he hadn't seen on her face in years. His stomach churned. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the intimacy, the ease with which they shared a world that excluded him. Unable to confront them outright, Gerald slipped out of the restaurant unnoticed. That night he returned home late, his mind a storm of anger and confusion. Jill was already asleep, her breathing steady. Gerald stared at her in the dim light of their bedroom, a stranger in the bed they once shared. The next morning Gerald woke to find Jill humming again, the same unfamiliar tune that had bothered him days before. She smiled as she poured coffee, the image of domestic serenity. "Big plans at work today?" she asked, her voice bright. "Always," Gerald replied, his tone flat. "How about you?" "Oh, just the usual errands," Jill said, waving a hand dismissively. Her words hung in the air, hollow and rehearsed. Gerald's gaze drifted to her handbag on the counter. While she turned to put dishes away, he reached into the bag and felt around. His fingers brushed against paper, a folded piece tucked inside. Later that day, in the solitude of his study, Gerald unfolded what he'd taken. It was a key, attached to a tag inscribed with the name of a local motel. His pulse quickened. This wasn't a misunderstanding or paranoia. The evidence was piling up, each piece adding weight to the betrayal he now knew was undeniable. That evening, Gerald didn't mention the key. Instead, he watched Jill closely. Every smile, every glance seemed deliberate, calculated. She wasn't just hiding something, she was protecting it. In the quiet of their home, Gerald made a decision. He would find out exactly how far this betrayal went. The shadows were growing, and Gerald knew it was only a matter of time before they consumed everything. Gerald Hand sat in his car outside the motel, the small brass key in his pocket feeling heavier than it had any right to. He stared at the neon sign flickering against the early evening sky, the name matching the tag attached to the key. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as he fought the instinct to turn back, but there was no turning back now. He needed answers. The receptionist barely looked up as Gerald entered the motel lobby. It was dimly lit, the faint hum of a television drifting from behind the counter. "Room 14, Gerald said, sliding the key across the counter. His voice was steady, but his heart pounded in his chest. The clerk raised an eyebrow but said nothing, handing over the logbook. Gerald signed it quickly, disguising his name with an illegible scrawl. The clerk handed him the key and waved him off with practiced disinterest. As Gerald approached the door to room 14, the world seemed to narrow around him. The hall was silent except for the faint creak of his footsteps on the carpet. He hesitated at the door, the key trembling in his hand. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked it and stepped inside. The room was simple, barely more than a bed, a table, and a chair. But it was what sat on the table that caught his eye, a framed photo of Jill and Walt, their smiles frozen in time. Beside it lay an envelope, its contents spilling out. Handwritten notes, receipts, and what appeared to be a map of a neighborhood. His neighborhood. Gerald's vision blurred with anger as he sifted through the notes. Words like escape and finalize leapt off the pages, each one a dagger to his chest. He spotted one note written in Jill's unmistakable handwriting. "Walt, it has to be this week. Gerald suspects nothing. The sooner we leave, the better." His hands shook as he folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was calculated, deliberate. The map of his neighborhood was marked with strange symbols, and Gerald realized with a sickening jolt that it detailed entrances, exits, and potential weak points of his home. A sharp knock on the door pulled Gerald from his thoughts. He froze, his mind racing. Without thinking, he grabbed the letter and slipped into the bathroom, pressing himself against the wall. The door creaked open and heavy footsteps entered the room. "Jill!" a familiar voice called. It was Walt. Gerald's fists clenched as he held his breath, listening. Walt muttered something under his breath before the sound of paper rustling filled the room. Moments later, the door closed again, and Gerald peeked out from his hiding place. The room was empty, but the tension lingered in the air. He left the motel quickly, his heart pounding as he drove home. Jill was in the living room when he arrived, her eyes lighting up briefly before dimming with suspicion. "You're home late," she said, her tone casual but probing. "Work ran over," Gerald replied evenly, hanging his coat by the door. He studied her closely, noting the faint tension in her posture. She was hiding something. Of that, he was certain. Later that night, while Jill slept, Gerald spread the notes and map across his desk. Every detail pointed to something far more sinister than an affair. This wasn't just about love, it was about planning, about control. What exactly had Jill and Walt been preparing for? And why did it involve his home? As the pieces began to come together, Gerald felt the weight of his world collapsing around him. The shadows of betrayal had deepened, revealing not just a crack in his marriage, but a chasm of lies. He knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. The aroma of roasted chicken filled the dining room as Jill set the final dish on the table. Gerald sat at the head, his expression unreadable, his thoughts an intricate web of anger, suspicion, and determination. Tonight he had invited Jill for a rare sit-down dinner, something he hadn't done in months. She had seemed surprised, but eager, perhaps seeing it as an olive branch in their strained relationship. Jill poured 2 glasses of wine and slid one toward Gerald. "This feels nice," she said, her tone hesitant but hopeful. Gerald nodded, picking up his glass but not drinking. His eyes studied her carefully, noting the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted her napkin. She was nervous. Did she sense that he knew? Or was this guilt gnawing at her conscience? "How was your day?" Gerald asked, his voice even. Jill smiled faintly. "Busy, as always. I had to run a few errands, then book club ran long." Gerald set his glass down with deliberate care. "Book club? You mean the one you've been attending every Wednesday?" "Yes, why?" Jill's response was immediate, but her eyes flickered, just for a moment. Gerald leaned forward, his gaze unrelenting. "It's funny. Sarah mentioned she stopped by the library today and didn't see any sign of your group." Jill froze. For a split second, her mask of calm cracked, but she recovered quickly, laughing lightly. "We didn't meet at the library this time. We tried something new. A cafe downtown." "A cafe?" Gerald repeated, tilting his head. "Which one?" Jill opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. Her hesitation stretched the silence between them, making it deafening. "You know," Gerald said, leaning back and crossing his arms. "I think you've been spending a lot of time downtown lately." Jill's eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you implying?" "Nothing," Gerald replied, his voice sharp but measured. "Just an observation." The tension between them thickened as the meal continued. Jill picked at her food, her usual appetite subdued. Gerald maintained his calm exterior, though his grip on the fork tightened with each passing minute. "I was thinking," Gerald began, breaking the silence, "maybe we should plan a weekend getaway. Just the 2 of us. Get away from everything." Jill blinked, startled. "A getaway? That sounds nice, but I've been so busy." "Too busy for your husband?" Gerald interrupted, his tone cutting. Jill stiffened. "Gerald, what's this about? You've been acting strange lately." "Strange?" Gerald let out a hollow laugh. "Maybe that's because I'm finally noticing things I should have seen long ago." Jill's face flushed, but she held his gaze. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Gerald reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded note he'd taken from the motel. He unfolded it slowly, deliberately, before sliding it across the table. "Explain this." Jill's breath hitched as she stared at the note. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, but stopped halfway. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "That doesn't matter," Gerald said, his voice cold. "What matters is what it means." Jill's silence spoke volumes. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and her eyes darted toward the wine glass in front of her as though searching for answers. "Gerald, I can explain." "Then start talking," he demanded, his voice rising slightly, "because I'm running out of patience." But Jill didn't speak. Instead, she stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I'm not doing this tonight," she said, her voice tight. "I don't have to explain myself to you." "Sit down," Gerald said firmly, his voice low but laced with a dangerous edge. "We're not finished." For a moment, Jill looked as though she might argue, but then she slowly sank back into her chair, her expression unreadable. The tension was palpable, and Gerald knew the dinner had achieved exactly what he intended. The cracks were widening, and the truth was on the verge of spilling out. The night was unnervingly still as Gerald Hand paced in his study, the faint ticking of the wall clock marking each agonizing second. The dinner had ended in icy silence, with Jill retreating to their bedroom without offering the explanation he demanded. Her final words echoed in his mind. "You'll regret digging into this, Gerald." Regret? The thought infuriated him. How could she twist the narrative when it was her lies unraveling their lives? Gerald clenched his fists and stared down at the papers and photos strewn across his desk, the damning evidence he had uncovered from the motel. But one question burned hotter than the rest. Why? Unable to suppress his anger, Gerald made a decision. It was time to confront Jill, once and for all. He stormed into the bedroom, his heart pounding. Jill stood by the dresser, her back turned as though she had been waiting for him. "We're talking about this now," Gerald demanded, his voice sharp and commanding. Jill turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "Fine," she said coldly, crossing her arms. "Ask your questions." He held up the note from the motel. "What is this? Planning to leave me? Planning to rob me blind?" His voice cracked, the words spilling out like venom. Jill sighed, her mask of calm cracking just slightly. "Gerald, you're overreacting." "Overreacting?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "You've been meeting him behind my back, laughing, scheming, plotting who knows what." For a moment, Jill said nothing. Then her lips curled into a bitter smile. "You want the truth? Fine." She stepped closer, her voice dropping into a venomous tone. "I am leaving you. Walt and we've been planning this for months." Gerald staggered back as though struck. The confirmation of her betrayal, so casual, so cruel, left him momentarily speechless. Jill pressed on, her voice rising with anger now. "You've spent years ignoring me, years treating me like some accessory to your perfect little image. Did you really think I'd stay forever?" He tried to steady his breathing, his hands trembling. "And what about this?" He slammed the map onto the dresser. "What's your plan with my house, my life?" Jill's expression shifted, momentary panic flashing in her eyes. "That's not what you think," she said quickly. "Then tell me," Gerald shouted, his voice cracking with rage. At that moment, the doorbell rang, piercing the tense air. Both of them froze, their eyes locked in a brief standoff before Gerald stormed out to answer it. Standing on the porch was Walt Maxwell, his face smug and defiant. "Gerald," Walt said smoothly, stepping into the house uninvited. "We need to talk." Gerald's blood boiled. "You've got some nerve showing up here," he growled, his fists clenched. Walt ignored him, his gaze shifting to Jill, who had followed Gerald into the foyer. "Jill, we should go," Walt said, his tone low but insistent. But Gerald stepped between them, his rage reaching a breaking point. "You think you can just walk in here and take my wife? My life?" Walt smirked, his arrogance cutting through Gerald's fury like a blade. "Gerald, face it. You lost her a long time ago. I'm just picking up the pieces." The words pushed Gerald over the edge. He lunged at Walt, grabbing him by the collar. "Get out of my house!" he roared, his voice shaking the walls. Jill screamed, trying to pull them apart, but it was too late. Gerald's anger had taken control, his rationality slipping away with every passing second. Walt shoved him back, his own temper flaring. "Go ahead, Gerald," Walt sneered. "Show her what kind of man you really are." The tension in the room reached its breaking point as the three stood locked in a triangle of rage and betrayal. The unspoken truth was clear. This night would end with no winners, only shattered lives. The tension in the room was suffocating, every breath Gerald Hand took seeming heavier than the last. Walt Maxwell stood just feet away, his smirk etched in defiance, while Jill lingered near the staircase, her hands trembling as she clutched the banister. The words exchanged moments earlier still echoed in Gerald's mind, each syllable fueling the fire already raging in his chest. "You've already lost, Gerald," Walt taunted, his tone calm but condescending. "You just can't accept it." Gerald's jaw tightened, his fists curling at his sides. "You come into my house, you take my wife, and now you stand there mocking me? You have no shame, do you?" Jill stepped forward, her voice shaky but desperate. "Stop it, both of you! This isn't solving anything!" But her plea only deepened Gerald's anger. He turned to her, his eyes burning. "And you, what were you thinking? Throwing everything away for him?" Jill's face crumpled, tears threatening to spill, but her voice sharpened. "Because you stopped seeing me, Gerald. I've been invisible to you for years." "That's no excuse," Gerald roared, his voice cracking. "We could have fixed this, talked, worked through it, but you chose to betray me." Walt stepped between them, his smirk replaced by a sneer. "Enough of this. Jill doesn't owe you an explanation. It's over, Gerald." "Get out," Gerald growled, his voice low and trembling with barely restrained rage. "Or what?" Walt snapped, taking a step closer. "You'll finally do something? Please, you're pathetic." The insult hit like a hammer, shattering the last fragments of Gerald's restraint. He lunged, grabbing Walt by the collar, slamming him against the wall. The crash reverberated through the house, and Jill screamed, rushing to pull them apart. "Stop it!" she begged, her voice cracking with panic. "Gerald, stop!" But Gerald didn't stop. The betrayal, the humiliation, the sheer audacity of Walt's words, it was all too much. His hands tightened around Walt's shirt, his knuckles white. Walt shoved him back, sending Gerald stumbling into the dining table. "Go ahead," Walt hissed, his voice laced with venom. "Show her what kind of man you really are." Gerald's hand found the edge of the table, and then his fingers brushed against something cold and solid, the handgun he had retrieved from his study earlier. His heart thundered as he picked it up, its weight grounding him, its presence undeniable. Jill froze, her eyes widening as she saw the weapon in Gerald's hand. "Gerald, no," she whispered, her voice thick with fear. Walt straightened, his expression shifting from defiance to alarm. "Gerald, put it down," he said, his tone cautious now. "We can talk about this." "Talk?" Gerald barked, his voice shaking. "After what you've done! After everything!" The room fell silent, the only sound the shallow, rapid breaths of everyone present. Gerald's finger hovered over the trigger, his mind racing. Memories of his life with Jill flashed before him, their wedding, the early years of their marriage, the quiet evenings that once brought peace. But those memories were now tainted, twisted by the shadows of her betrayal. "Gerald," Jill said softly, taking a tentative step forward. "Please, don't." But Gerald's hands trembled, his grip tightening on the gun. "You destroyed everything," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Everything." And then, in an instant, it happened. The deafening crack of a gunshot shattered the silence, followed by Jill's scream. Walt staggered back, clutching his chest as blood bloomed across his shirt. He collapsed to the floor, his eyes wide in shock. Jill rushed to him, sobbing uncontrollably. "No, Walt, oh my God!" But Gerald wasn't done. The betrayal still burned, and as Jill turned to face him, her tear-streaked face pleading, he raised the gun again. "Gerald, please!" she begged, her voice barely a whisper. Another shot rang out, and Jill fell, her body crumpling beside Walt's. The room went silent again, the echoes of the gunfire fading into the stillness of the night. Gerald stood motionless, the gun slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stared at the scene before him, the two people who had destroyed his life now lying lifeless at his feet. Gerald Hand stood in the living room, his breath shallow, his ears ringing from the two gunshots that had shattered his world. The silence that followed felt deafening, his gaze fixated on the lifeless bodies of Jill and Walt sprawled on the floor, blood pooling beneath them. Time seemed to freeze, yet his mind raced, struggling to process what had just happened. A flood of emotions surged through him, rage, regret, fear. But one thought rose above all others. He couldn't let anyone know the truth. Gerald knelt beside Jill, his trembling hands reaching out but stopping short of touching her. Her face, once so familiar, now felt distant and unrecognizable. "Why did you make me do this?" he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible in the stillness. The weight of what he'd done pressed down on him. He had to act. Rising to his feet, Gerald moved with a numb determination. His eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. The overturned dining chair, the shattered wine glass near the table, the gun lying on the floor. Everything screamed chaos, but not the kind he needed. If the police saw this scene, they'd know. They'd piece it together. He had to make it look like something else, something random, something plausible. Gerald grabbed the gun and wiped it down carefully, erasing any trace of his fingerprints. He placed it on the floor near Walt, angling it to suggest he had dropped it in a struggle. Then he went to the window by the front door. Using a chair, he smashed the glass, scattering shards onto the floor and porch outside. The sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood, but Gerald didn't flinch. He was too deep in his task to care. He moved quickly, overturning furniture, pulling drawers open and scattering their contents. A vase crashed to the ground, sending shards of porcelain flying. Gerald paused, his breath coming in sharp bursts as he surveyed his work. The scene now resembled a botched home invasion, but was it convincing enough? Returning to the bodies, Gerald hesitated. He couldn't look at Jill's face again, so he focused on Walt. He slipped a few valuables, a watch, a bracelet, into Walt's pocket, as if the intruder had dropped them in their panic. Then he stood, his hands shaking as he adjusted a picture frame on the mantel that had remained eerily upright. The effort to make it all look believable consumed him, but doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. Would the police see through it? Would they question why nothing of real value had been taken? Would they notice the faint but unmistakable signs of his rage, his desperation? Gerald wiped his hands on a kitchen towel, then tossed it into the sink. His eyes flicked to the clock. Nearly an hour had passed since the first shot rang out. He couldn't wait any longer. Picking up the phone, Gerald dialed 911, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. When the operator answered, he forced his voice to quiver. "There's been a break-in," he said, his tone heavy with feigned panic. My wife and my friend, they've been shot." The words tasted bitter as they left his lips. He hung up and sank into the couch, his head in his hands. The room, once the center of his carefully constructed life, now felt foreign, hostile, broken beyond repair. Flashing lights bathed the walls moments later, and the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Gerald inhaled deeply, preparing himself for what was to come. The scene was set. Now he could only hope it would hold. Detective Harris surveyed the living room, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The scene was chaotic: shattered glass, overturned furniture, and two bodies lying in pools of blood. It screamed violence, yet something about it felt calculated. The rookie officers shuffled uncomfortably, clearly unnerved by the gruesome sight. Harris crouched by Walt Maxwell's body, his gaze narrowing on the faint smudges on the handgun lying nearby. "Bag this," he said to the nearest officer, his tone brisk, "and check it for prints. Let's see if this intruder was as sloppy as the scene suggests." Gerald Hand sat on the couch, his face buried in his hands. His shirt was rumpled and his breathing was shallow. Harris approached him cautiously, his notebook in hand. "Mr. Hand," he began, his voice steady, "can you walk me through what happened tonight?" Gerald looked up, his eyes red and glassy. I came home late from work," he stammered. "The door was open. When I walked in, I saw them lying there." He choked on the words, his hands trembling. "It must have been a burglary. They shot them." Harris nodded, jotting notes as Gerald spoke. But his sharp instincts caught the cracks in the story, the slight hesitation in Gerald's tone, the over-explained details. "Did you touch anything?" Harris asked, his gaze unwavering. Gerald shook his head quickly. "No. I called 911 right away." Behind Harris, a forensic technician motioned him over. "Detective, take a look at this," the tech said, pointing to the broken window near the front door. "The glass shards are mostly outside. If someone broke in, wouldn't more be inside?" Harris frowned. "Good catch. Mark that down." He turned back to Gerald, his expression unreadable. "We'll need a full statement from you tomorrow," he said, his tone neutral but firm. As the investigation unfolded, inconsistencies began to pile up. Fingerprint analysis revealed something damning. The gun used in the murders had been wiped clean, but faint traces of Gerald's prints remained on the grip. More troubling was the lack of any other prints, suggesting the scene had been tampered with. Then there was the map. Discovered crumpled in the corner of the study, it showed detailed markings of Gerald's house, annotated with cryptic notes. Harris studied it closely, his unease growing. Why would an intruder leave behind something so incriminating? The neighbors added another layer to the mystery. One reported hearing raised voices earlier in the evening, followed by loud crashes and what sounded like an argument. "It didn't sound like strangers," the neighbor told Harris. "It sounded personal." The final piece came from Jill's handbag, which the techs meticulously catalogued. Inside, they found a key to a motel room registered under Walt Maxwell's name. Paired with a series of receipts for expensive dinners and cryptic handwritten notes, it painted a picture of a relationship that had gone far beyond friendship. Harris sat at his desk that night, the case file open before him. Every piece of evidence pointed in one direction. This wasn't a random burglary gone wrong. The signs of rage, the inconsistencies in Gerald's story, the staged scene, it all suggested something far more deliberate. "Gerald Hand," Harris muttered under his breath, tapping his pen against the desk. "What are you hiding?" The courtroom buzzed with tension as spectators filled the gallery, their murmurs blending into a low hum. At the center of it all sat Gerald Hand, his face pale but composed, his hands clasped tightly on the table in front of him. The prosecution had built a damning case, and Gerald knew this trial would determine not just his fate, but how the world would remember him. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Valerie Kemp, rose from her seat and strode toward the jury. Her presence commanded attention. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady and resolute. "This case is about betrayal, rage, and ultimately premeditated murder." She gestured toward the evidence table where the gun, the map, and the receipts were displayed. "The evidence will show that Gerald Hand meticulously staged the crime scene to mislead investigators. But no amount of broken glass or overturned furniture can erase the truth." Kemp turned toward the jury, her expression hardening. This wasn't a burglary. This was a calculated act by a man consumed by anger and a need for control. Gerald's defense attorney, Robert Nolan, stood as Kemp returned to her seat. He adjusted his glasses and took a moment to address the jury. "What the prosecution describes as premeditated is, in reality, a tragedy born of emotional devastation. Gerald Hand is not a monster. He's a man pushed to the brink by betrayal." Nolan's voice softened as he continued. "You will hear about the affair between Jill Hand and Walt Maxwell, a betrayal that shattered the foundation of Gerald's life. And while the events of that night were horrific, they were not planned. They were the actions of a man blinded by pain, not malice." The first witness called to the stand was Detective Harris. He described the crime scene in meticulous detail, his words painting a vivid picture of the chaos Gerald had left behind. Kemp pressed him on the inconsistencies in Gerald's story and the evidence that pointed to a staged break-in. "The broken window," Harris explained, "had glass primarily outside, suggesting it was broken from the inside. Additionally, the fingerprints on the gun were faint, as if they had been wiped clean, but traces matching Mr. Hand's were still present," Nolan countered during cross-examination. "Detective Harris, isn't it true that heightened emotional states can lead to irrational actions, even by otherwise rational individuals?" Harris hesitated. "That's possible," he admitted, though his tone remained cautious. The prosecution's next move was calling a neighbor to the stand. The witness recounted hearing loud voices and crashing sounds from the Hand residence on the night of the murders. "It sounded like an argument," the neighbor said. "Like someone was really angry." Kemp leaned forward. "Did it sound like strangers?" "No," the neighbor replied. "It sounded personal." The turning point came when Nolan presented evidence of Walt's financial troubles and his plans to start a new life with Jill. He argued that these factors painted Walt as a manipulative figure, using Jill to escape his own failures. "Gerald was not the aggressor," Nolan stated firmly. "He was a victim of circumstance." But Kemp was prepared. She presented Jill's journal, a collection of entries that revealed her growing unhappiness in her marriage and her conflicted feelings about leaving Gerald. The final entry read, "I don't want to hurt Gerald, but I can't stay in this life. Walt says we'll be free soon. I hope he's right." The courtroom fell silent as the weight of those words settled over the room. Kemp's closing argument was brief but impactful. Gerald Hand chose to take lives rather than face the consequences of his failing marriage. This was not self-defense, it was vengeance. As the jury was dismissed to deliberate, Gerald sat silently, his thoughts racing. Every decision, every action, every lie he had told to protect himself now hung in the balance. He cast a glance at the evidence table. The items that had once been part of his life now reduced to exhibits in a case that could end with his freedom or his condemnation. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in, their faces solemn. Gerald Hand sat motionless, his hands gripping the edge of the defense table as though it might steady him against the weight of what was to come. Robert Nolan leaned in, whispering, "Stay calm, Gerald. Whatever happens, we'll appeal." But Gerald wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on the jury foreman, a middle-aged man with a neatly pressed suit and a face that betrayed no emotion. The judge nodded for the foreman to speak. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Gerald Hand, guilty of first-degree murder." The words struck like a thunderclap, echoing in Gerald's mind. He didn't flinch, didn't move, but the air seemed to drain from the room. Behind him, faint murmurs rippled through the gallery, a mix of shock, satisfaction, and hushed disbelief. The judge's voice cut through the noise. "Mr. Hand, you have been found guilty of the premeditated murders of Jill Hand and Walter Maxwell. I hereby sentence you to death by lethal injection." His gavel struck sharply, sealing Gerald's fate. Nolan placed a steadying hand on Gerald's shoulder, but the gesture felt hollow. Gerald turned slightly, glancing toward the gallery. Most faces were strangers, but a few stood out. Sarah, his cousin, tears streaming down her cheeks. A former colleague shaking his head in muted disappointment. None of them could meet his eyes for long. As he was led out in handcuffs, Gerald felt the stares bore into him. Some were accusatory, others curious, but none were forgiving. The weight of the sentence pressed down on him, yet deep inside, there was an odd sense of inevitability. This was the end he had always feared but never truly prepared for. Weeks turned into months as Gerald awaited his fate in the cold confines of death row. Appeals were filed, arguments made, but the truth loomed like a shadow over every proceeding. Gerald had pulled the trigger. Twice. And no amount of legal maneuvering could erase the fact that 2 lives were lost by his hand. One evening, years later, his attorney arrived with unexpected news. "Gerald, your sentence has been commuted to life imprisonment without parole," Nolan said, his voice flat but laced with relief. "The courts are phasing out the death penalty." Gerald nodded slowly, the words barely registering. Life without parole, the same cold walls, the same stark routines, but now no end in sight, no closure, no reprieve. Sitting alone in his cell, Gerald reflected on the chain of events that led him here. The betrayal, the rage, the choices. He thought of Jill's last words. "You'll regret digging into this, Gerald," and wondered if, in some way, she had foreseen this bitter ending. On the small desk beside his cot lay a journal provided by the prison staff. Gerald hadn't written much, but tonight he picked up the pen and stared at the blank page. After a long pause, he wrote, "I thought I could fix everything by holding on tighter, but I was wrong. Sometimes letting go is the only way to truly keep what matters." He closed the journal and leaned back, the faint sounds of prison life humming beyond the bars. Outside, the world moved on without him, a world he had destroyed with his own hands. Gerald closed his eyes, knowing that his punishment wasn't just life in prison. It was the memory of what he had lost, haunting him every single day. What do you think of Gerald Hand and the choices he made? Could things have turned out differently? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts.